now I've got the wonderful and glorious and beautiful Dr. Gillian Ross to introduce you to. Love Jillian. She's coming on in a minute. Let me tell you a little bit about Jillian. Dr. Gillian Ross left academic life in the 80s to explore an alternative lifestyle, moving to the country with her family. She trained as a yoga teacher and shiatsu therapist and fell in love with meditation and evolutionary mysticism. Jillian has published 4 books, but she's best known for her yoga and meditation CDs, which she started recording through the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, in the 90s. Her 40-acre home in northern New South Wales has become a spiritual haven for retreats and workshops. And today, Jillian is going to talk to us about evolutionary mysticism and the emergence of the planetary mind. Welcome, Jillian.
Thank you so much, Karen. Sounds like Roman's a bit of a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. In some ways, we're on the same page. Anyway, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share something of my passion for evolutionary mysticism with what I hope will be a very receptive audience, and of course, alongside so many very interesting speakers. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation, who for thousands of years have lived harmoniously in this Nimbin Valley in northern New South Wales, where I'm so privileged to be living now. And it's really great that we are at last beginning to recognise that we have so much to learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters in these challenging times. So first, let us address the core challenge that I see. There we go. I will be punctuating my talk with some, I hope would be for inspiring quotes for you. At least I hope they're as inspiring for you as they are for me as we go along. So clearly, beloveds, the human consciousness is now the driving force of evolution on planet Earth. There isn't a single atom on the planet that is not impacted upon by human behavior, by human consciousness. This is unprecedented. The future destiny of our planet, of our Mother Earth, rests in human hands. That is an awesome responsibility. And sadly, the current level of human consciousness is simply not equipped for the task. It is taking us, with a great deal of the natural world, on a high-tech, high-speed, high-consumption joyride into an abyss of extinction. And sadly, beloveds, no meaningful, well-meaning reduction in our carbon emissions or use of plastic bags or whatever is going to do anything more than slow the vehicle down, if that. If we are to change our trajectory and live harmoniously and sustainably on our Mother Earth, we have to change the consciousness of the driver. The current level of consciousness is the ego, the separate self, and I include in that the mental, rational level that we're so enamored of. Christian mystic and scholar Cynthia Bourgeault said recently that expecting to resolve our current existential crises from the level of consciousness of the mental egoic ego is like trying to learn to play the violin with a chainsaw. Well, that was wonderful. So egoic consciousness has sort of crept up on us for what, over the last 12,000 years since the inception of agriculture. And it's given us great material progress. I mean, it's given us the wonderful technology that we're enjoying at the moment, but at huge cost, dangerous cost to our spiritual and our emotional evolution. I came across a quote from an evolutionary biologist recently where she said, put Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and 21st century physics in a blender, and you've got problems. And we have. The root problem with the ego, and therefore the primary cause of so many of our crises, is that it is deeply immersed in stories of separation. It's telling us that we're separate from each other. How absurd. It is telling us that we are separate from our own inner depths and heights. It's taken us into flatland and disconnected us from the inner realms. That's a bit of a disaster. And perhaps most tragic at all, it's disconnected us from our kinship with the natural world. And this disconnection from the natural world was beautifully expressed for us back in the early 1920s from the D.H. Lawrence. I came across this wonderful quote from him where he said, "Oh, what a catastrophe for man when he cut himself off from his union with the sun and the earth. That is what is the matter with us. We are bleeding at the roots. Love is a grinning mockery, because, poor blossom, we plucked it from its stem on the tree of life and expected it to keep on blossoming in our civilized vase on the table." And for me, perhaps the most poignant manifestation of this disconnect from the natural world for me is the abomination of factory farming. But there are many others. Our stories of separation have caused so much suffering and cruelty in our history. Enough is enough. Egoic consciousness has put the consciousness in a straitjacket. It has stultified our evolution. Einstein used to speak of the prison of the ego, and it's simply not worthy of us. Because the fact is that throughout history and across cultures, we have worshipped, indeed adored, individuals who manifested a very different level of consciousness, far vaster, far more benign than our skin-encapsulated, fear-driven egos. We've called them awakened beings. Well, the fact is that that awakened consciousness is no longer the prerogative of the saint or the saint or St. Francis or even a Jesus or a Buddha. It is the birthright of each and every one of us. We are all of us mystics at heart, all capable of experiencing and living the transforming power of mystical experiences, of a mystical connection with our divine source. And, beloveds, at this critical time in Earth's history, it is becoming nothing less than our duty, our responsibility, to wake up and help take the ego out of the driving seat urgently and collectively. And because we are in such a privileged position in our so-called developed nation, developed societies, we have our basic needs met. We're in a position to do that, to help with that. So what I'm going to offer is a sort of map that I see as aiding our transformation imperative, what we could call our consciousness revolution. So firstly, beloveds, we urgently need the help of a new globally uniting story around what it means to be human. A story that can help to heal and make whole and holy our fragmented world and our fragmented psyches, the fragmentation Reverend was talking about. A story that will inspire nothing less than a mystical renaissance, which will in turn bring forth a whole new sense of self. A consciousness that could guide us into the beautiful world our hearts know is possible. The beautiful world our hearts know is possible is actually the title of a book, some of you may know of it, by Charles Eisenstein. I commend him to you. He's one of the great thinkers and philosophers of our time. You can find heaps of him on YouTube. He is most interesting to listen to on all of this. Charles Eisenstein. So humankind has always had uplifting stories, right through cultures, across history, across cultures and through history. We've had stories, uplifting stories, creation stories that give stories that bring meaning and purpose and morality into our lives. But we have no such globally uniting, inspiring story at the moment. The prevailing story, the prevailing Western world view, which now, of course, has been proselytized across the entire planet, is that we are nothing more than accidental specks of consciousness that have somehow emerged from a purposeless universe of dead matter. I mean, how absurd. That's scientific materialism. And it's taken a pretty good hold on our mainstream culture. No wonder we have an epidemic of depression, of drug addiction, of teenage suicide. No wonder we've had to invent a new religion of consumerism, where buying stuff has become a way of masking the purposelessness of life. But the good news is that there is a new story taking wings across the planet, and it's known as evolutionary mysticism. Also sometimes evolutionary spirituality, but because the mainstream spirituality has a bit of a pejorative edge to it, I prefer to call it evolutionary mysticism. And it tells us that our universe is a vast, interconnected, evolving, endlessly creative, purposeful, numinous reality. In other words, fused with the divine light. And every atom, every cell, every living being is an utterly sacred manifestation of a sublime, transcendent consciousness or intelligence. I avoid the term God because it carries too much patriarchal baggage for me and doesn't really encapsulate the magnificence of that. That new story aligns beautifully, of course, with the big history story of cosmic evolution known as cosmogenesis. Wonderful word, cosmogenesis, the Big Bang story. All evolutionary mysticism is doing is breathing sentience and sacredness into that awesome discovery of science. And it is an awesome discovery. The discovery of evolution, of cosmogenesis, has been described as the greatest discovery of the entire scientific enterprise. It's so awesome. And some of you may have heard of Brian Swimme, the cosmologist Brian Swimme. He was the first person actually to introduce me to evolutionary mysticism back in the 90s with his wonderful video series, Canticles to the Cosmos. And of course, I fell madly in love with him. But anyway, he's still delightful, and you can find him on YouTube. And he tries to sort of get through to his audience just how amazing cosmogenesis is by saying, take hydrogen gas, a colorless, odorless gas. One of the first elements to emerge after the flaring forth of energy that we call the Big Bang. Leave it alone, just do nothing to it for 13.8 billion years, and it becomes giraffes and rose bushes and human beings, etc., etc. I mean, what is going on? To really feel into that is like a mystical experience. And then the amazing universe that science has opened up for us. Just think of those images from the Hubble telescope. And of course, you have one on your screen now, the Andromeda Nebula. Just extraordinary, the vastness and the sheer beauty of it. The universe oozes beauty. Or just go and lie out on the earth on a clear night. Feel the power of gravity holding you to this vast earth, and look up at the Milky Way, our galaxy. Drink in its energy. And come and absorb to reflect on the scientific understanding that there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the planet. I mean, talk about awesome. It's a mystical experience. So, you know, what we have to understand is the transforming power of this new story rests on it being experienced viscerally in that way. It has to be embodied. Only then will it become the foundation for a whole new culture and a new religion. So I invite you at this stage, beloveds, to close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and relax back into your heart energy. Rest your awareness in your heart. And just absorb what I'm about to say with your heart intelligence, because it's so critical to our consciousness evolution. And it's very profound. A core revelation of evolutionary mysticism, critical to our consciousness revolution, is that the transcendent consciousness that birthed our universe is at this time in history becoming aware of itself through the consciousness of the human. I repeat that. That transcendent intelligence is at this time in history becoming aware of itself through us, through the consciousness of the human. The divine intelligence that is orchestrating the whole glorious drama of evolution is yearning to express itself, herself, through us in our thoughts and actions. If we reflect deeply on that, it means that it is our destiny to allow this sublime transpersonal intelligence to work through us consciously and creatively. Not my will, my little ego, but thy will, capital T, capital W, be done. I think that is the mantra of our time. Not my will, but thy will be done. And it's a realization that reminds me of Chinese Taoism. The Taoists say that liberation comes when you can flow in the current of the eternal Tao. And in evolutionary mysticism, this divine will is understood as being the eros, or the love force of the universe. It's also called the evolutionary impulse. And it's a core understanding that aligning ourselves with this divine eros, or evolutionary impulse, brings forth ever greater goodness, truth, and beauty, and more joy into our personal lives, and certainly less stress. So in other words, our new story of evolutionary mysticism is bringing forth a mystical renaissance. The two are inextricably interwoven. It will be impotent if it does not engage an inner journey in which we learn to surrender in a spirit of devotion to a consciousness far greater than our ego. Not my will, but thy will be done. In the words of the wonderful Joseph Campbell, we have to become transparent to the transcendent. Isn't that gorgeous? Transparent to the transcendent. So the quote here from the wonderful Jean Houston: at this time in our history, the greatest accelerator of evolution is mystical experience. That is amazing, and that's really the whole substance of my talk. But it's surprising coming from Jean Houston. She was one of the pioneers of the human potential movement back in the 70s. She's still going strong. She has several PhDs in philosophy, psychology, and so on. And I never thought of her as a mystic, so I was really delighted to hear her say this, and put this great emphasis on mystical experience, which I am trying to do. And she is echoing a favorite quote of mine from Christian mystic Father Wayne Teasdale. Breathe this one in. He says, mysticism is perhaps the most precious treasure entrusted to our human family, and it is our most effective resource for the transformation of our attitudes, actions, and lives. Get that, the most effective resource for the transformation of our attitudes, actions, and lives. So many of our contemporary psychotherapists would do well to get a handle on that one. And some of them are. You might have heard of Gabor Mate, become a very popular, lovely man, become a very popular trauma and addiction therapist. And I heard him quote recently from someone he obviously agreed with, saying that all problems are emotional, all solutions are spiritual. I like that. And of course, the great Carl Jung very famously said towards the end of his life that the approach to the numinous, the divine light, is the real therapy. Insofar as you approach to the numinous, you are freed from the curse of pathology. Oh, there we go. There we go. Oh, I've jumped one now. This was the one after next. So the other was a poem from the mystic poet Hafiz. So I'll just recite it for you. The beautiful poem. I showed an image of a rose, and the words were, how did the rose ever open her heart and give all her beauty to the world? She felt the encouragement of light upon her being. Otherwise, we all remain too frightened. And I think the poem is a beautiful metaphor for the experience of mystic meditation, which I believe is an essential tool for our mystical renaissance and our conscious revolution. And I distinguish between mystic meditation and mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation becoming very popular, it's great, but mystic meditation is a different quality. It is devotional. It's a meditation practice where you go into stillness and silence in a spirit of surrendering, of heart opening to this consciousness far greater than your own, imaged in any way, Jesus, Mary, whatever, any mask of eternity, as Campbell called them, or simply as the divine light. For me, spiritual work and meditation in particular is about connection with the everlasting light of awareness within us and allowing it to shine through the consciousness of our daily life. And I might digress into near-death experiences here that are becoming so well known, so well documented, where people do experience that uncreated, that extraordinary, exquisite light, when they move beyond this realm for a little while and then come back after a near-death experience. But you don't have to die to get that experience. Believe you me, you just open yourself up in this mystic meditation, surrender in a spirit of devotion, diligently and persistently. Persistence is an important word. And you will experience the light, or you will be gifted with grace. The mystics of all times and places have tasted the mystery that is the everlasting light and tell us that it is the energy of love, of exquisite, unconditional love. Everything in the universe is bringing forth in a unique way the uncreated light that is both its source, sustenance, and substance. And if only everyone on the planet, or at least our leaders, could have a taste, just a fleeting taste of the reality of that divine light, it would be a very different world. But that is the promise of our mystical renaissance. Maybe for some future generation, some future civilization. And that promise is beautifully expressed in a verse from the great evolutionary mystic Sri Aurobindo, exploring consciousness in the mid-20th century. And in his epic poem Savriti, he writes, he had a vision of a future humanity, and he writes, "Earth will become the home of heaven's light." Isn't that beautiful? Earth will become the home of heaven's light. And spirit's tops and nature's base will draw near the secret of their separate truths and know each other as one deity. And spirit will look out through matter's gaze, and matter will reveal the spirit's face. However, a warning. At this stage in our evolution, our mystical experiences can be so readily hijacked by the ego. Believe you me, a spiritualized ego is a lot more stultifying and indeed dangerous than one that is not spiritualized. It can lead to spiritual materialism, ego inflation, enormous ego inflation, and another one, transcendentalism, which has become, I've observed it among non-dual teachers and non-dual students, where they have bliss experiences and unity consciousness or something, and it takes them away from any interest in the physical realm. You just want to escape from the physical realm, and that's not what we're being called to do at the moment. And this is why this danger of being hijacked by the ego, this is why our new story is so critical to our consciousness revolution, because it anchors our mystical experiences in an understanding that we are participating in a cosmic drama of love, in which we all have a unique part to play, a duty to play in a way. So our mystical experiences then becomes a means to awaken the divine will within us to serve the greater good with humility and compassion. You know, the Sufis speak of different stages in the spiritual journey, and the experience of unity consciousness is not the ultimate. There is a stage, a station beyond that, and they call it the station of servanthood. In other words, beyond your unity consciousness, beyond your unity with the divine, you return to the marketplace and you serve the greater good. You serve the awakening of the rest of humanity. Beloveds, we're entering the age of universal mysticism. For the first time ever, we can harvest the wisdom and spiritual technologies, not only of our own traditions, but those of all other traditions that have ever existed, including those of our indigenous people. And we don't need a priest or a guru anymore. Sort of what Roman was hinting at too. I mean, a spiritual teacher or guru may be helpful in the early stages of your spiritual journey, but there's another, I've got full of so many beautiful quotes. Another quote I love from naturalist David Abram, I think it was in his book, Becoming Animal, where he said, "Carnally immersed as we are in a living, breathing planet, we each have our own access to the mystery, our own intimate access to the mystery. carnally immersed as we are in a living, breathing planet, we each have our own intimate access to the mystery. I think that's pretty gorgeous too. But of course, psychotherapies have a role to play in this consciousness revolution, and there's certainly no shortage of them in our I, me, mine culture. They can help to liberate us from the many emotional blockages that hinder or distort our encounter with the inner light. But I do think that we greatly underestimate the healing power of mystical experiences in themselves when combined with our new story, as I alluded to earlier with Jung and Gabor Mate. And as Brian says, vis-a-vis our new story, this is Brian Swim again, quote, "Cosmology, when it is alive and healthy in a culture, evokes in the human a deep zest for life, a zest that is satisfying and revivifying, for it provides the psychic energy necessary to begin each day with joy." But the ego doesn't do that. The power of cosmology. Mystical experience, when it is grounded in and inspired by the uniting wisdom of our new story, totally transforms our engagement with life. Without it, we're nothing like, we're victims of our conditioning and our traumas and so on. We're like a boat thrown out onto the ocean without a sail or a rudder or a compass. But, in the words of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, another of the mystic poets, if we listen to the intelligence of the earth, we would rise up rooted like trees. He goes on, instead we entangle ourselves in knots of our own making and struggle lonely and confused. And we could add that in these challenging times, we're witnessing just how much an egoic entanglement of fear and alienation can become breeding ground for divisive and dangerous fundamentalism, not to mention crazy conspiracy theories. So looking at our slide here, sacred perception. What we find within ourselves molds our reality. The inner enriches the outer. With our mystical experience, the world becomes re-enchanted, rejuiced with a sense of the sacred. In other words, contrary to commonly perceived thinking, the inner journey does not isolate us from the world. It enriches our participation in it, as I was saying earlier. And here's the thing, beloveds. When we connect with our divine source and with our kinship with the sacred universe, this is our new story, we birth a whole new sense of self. The ego is replaced, taken out of the driving seat, shed like a discarded snakeskin. And I'm going to endeavor to change the slide again, because we're moving now to the emergence of our snowflake self, the emergence of a new sense of self. Not working, but I will continue. I've called this emerging self in the past the snowflake self, because I was thinking that just as each unique, gorgeous snowflake is a crystallization of water, so each one of us is a gorgeous, unique crystallization of the infinite. However, I would also, I think, like the notion of the fragility of the snowflake self, because at this stage in our evolution, our emerging snowflake self is indeed fragile. It so easily, as we well know, contracts back into ego consciousness. However, I've been told the snowflake self sounds sort of vaguely pejorative, flaky, whatever. So let's call it the sacred self. But of course, confusingly, there are many selves around these days. There's evolutionary self, sacred self, unique self, and we're calling this the higher self, Expo, and so on. I avoid higher self because it doesn't have a feeling of embodiment, and the self I'm talking about is definitely embodied. So I'm calling it the sacred self. And in saying that, I'm aligning with Sri Aurobindo's idea of our psychic being, where he speaks of the divine spark in the heart of each of us that is waiting to be awakened and is yearning to be reunited with the transcendent. So, what is emerging in our time, amongst so many of us now, we hope, is the sacred self. So we have sort of two selves at the moment. We have our ego self, we could call it that, a self, delusional self, and our sacred self. And their flavors are so different. We can very easily be aware of when we're acting from one and when we're acting from the other. Now, how am I going for time? Right. Because I just want to sort of run through a few of the differences between them to give you a feeling for that. The sacred self says an unqualified yes to life, and it responds rather than reacts. So I have to move very quickly through these. I think the sacred self has to have feelings. The ego has emotions. What's the difference between them? When you become aware of a feeling, it becomes it becomes more intense. When you're becoming aware of an emotion, it becomes less intense. An example of a sacred self feeling would be grief, deep grief for the tragedy of the earth at the moment. And if you go deeply into that grief, it deepens and it can break open the heart and lead to a transformation in consciousness. The ego, of course, does a lot of thinking, thoughts all over the place. The sacred self has more control over the thinking mind. And I have a lovely recollection of Eckhart Tolle on this. Eckhart Tolle, I heard him being asked once what the greatest spiritual gift he'd received from his awakening, his spiritual awakening. And after a typical sort of Eckhart pregnant pause, he said, I can choose not to think. I like that. So we could say the sacred self can choose not to think. And of course, it has capacity for unconditional love, a heightened receptivity to beauty. But above all, the sacred self loves to serve. Serves the divine beloved, transcendent in doing so serves the greater good. And it does it with humility, such an important quality of the mystic, humility, and with gratitude, and with joy. All the mystical traditions speak of joy as being the essence of the divine. An awakening heart begins to have access to a deep well of joy. It's not diminished or conditioned in any way by outward events. The sacred self begins to understand what Joseph Campbell meant when he said it's possible to participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world. The sacred self can participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world, and my word, we need to develop that skill. So in short, our sacred self is giving us an inkling of what the Dalai Lama meant when he said, the aim of life is to embody the transcendent. I'm sorry I'm not getting any more slides up. There we go. And many other lovely quotes on the sacred self that you're now missing. But embodiment is the critical word here, because our emerging sacred self is forging new neuronal pathways in our brain and in our nervous system. Cynthia Bourgeois speaks of a switching, using a computer analogy, says it's like switching onto a new operating system. However, we must, with all humility, realize that we're just kindergarten children in all of that. Part of our awakening to sacred self is to awaken our mystical anatomy. I've referred to the heart chakra, but also all the other chakras, and purify our bodies to become a vessel for the divine. And of course, Kundalini energy is a huge part of that, purifying energy that is arising across the planet at this time. We haven't time to go into any of that. So in all humility, we're just kindergarten children. Our sacred self gives us no more than an inkling of what it might yet mean to embody the transcendent. And mystics of the past have mapped many higher states of consciousness that could become a norm for humans in future generations, making Earth a home for heaven's light. So I just want to now briefly mention sacred activism, because one of the most uplifting elements of evolutionary mysticism is the understanding that each one of us in our sacred self has a unique and holy part to play in the unfolding cosmic drama of love that is evolution. And I love here the analogy of the circular rose window of Church Cathedral. We're each like a shard of glass in that magnificent whole, the beauty of that magnificent whole. We might not see the beauty of the whole, but we feel our way into the where we're meant to be once we surrender to the evolutionary impulse that I spoke of earlier. Which brings us to the emergence of what Andrew Harvey, and I won't have time to rave about Andrew Harvey, calls sacred activism. Because when our well-meaning activism for justice, for climate change action or whatever, is guided and fired by a mystical connection to our divine source, a holy power, a holy force is born in us, nothing less than a quantum leap in empowerment. And when sacred selves come together for the greater good, that empowerment is amplified 1,000 times. Christ said, did he not, that when 2 or more gathered in my name, I will be in your midst. And that is what is happening when sacred activists come together in these challenging times. So Andrew speaks of networks of grace for these communities of sacred activists that are emerging now across the planet. We can say this weekend, this Expo is an example of a network of grace. And because of the internet, of course, there are many of them arising across the planet. Spiritual teachers having hundreds of students, all yearning for this new consciousness and having mystical experiences. So is it not possible that just as billions of years ago, atoms danced together to form molecules, and molecules came together to form cells, and cells came together to form multicellular organisms, and the biosphere took off? Is it not possible that these networks of grace across the planet and our sacred selves will unite, ultimately connect in a network of light around the planet, becoming like the nervous system of Gaia, the planetary mind? And this was envisioned by one of the great evolutionary mystics, Teilhard de Chardin, writing in the last century, a Catholic priest and paleontologist, a scientist. And he saw envisaged a Christ-realized sphere of consciousness around the earth, which he called the noosphere. Brian Swim, you can find Brian Swim talking about the noosphere on YouTube and his Earth project. And of course, there's nothing to do with further advances in physical technology, no need for quantum computers or whatever. But the ego simply is not able to connect with the noosphere. To anticipate the ego consciousness evolving a noosphere is like expecting an old-fashioned typewriter to connect with the internet. It's just not capable of it. So I do wish I could bring up another slide for you, but there's slate schemes and all of that. So to conclude, beloveds, now human consciousness is like a bud on the cosmic vine. And science now tells us that from the very beginning, from the emergence and flaring forth of the Big Bang, conditions were absolutely right, just right, finely tuned exquisitely for the emergence of that exotic bloom. But at this stage in our evolution, it is poised to either fully flower or wither on the vine. And an even more graphic way of looking at it is that we are at a crossroad, a T-junction. Turning one way with the ego in the driving seat, we are on the road to hell on earth. But if enough of us become sacred activists, guided by the evolutionary impulse and participating in networks of grace, humankind may yet find itself on the road to the most beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Come what may, we will evolve the resilience and courage to face whatever arises in these uncertain times with acceptance, compassion, and even joy. Now, all that I've said is summed up in a beautiful verse from Christopher Fry, English author Christopher Fry, again writing in the last century. Please close your eyes again and feel this into your heart. I will unpack it as we go. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to meet us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the largest stride of soul folk ever took. What a wonderful way of describing our evolution from ego to sacred self, the largest stride of soul folk ever took. Affairs are now soul-sized. The enterprise is exploration into God. In other words, our mystical renaissance. The enterprise is exploration into God. He concludes, where are you making for? It takes so many years, thousands of years to wake. In other words, it's taken thousands of years for consciousness to reach a point where it is ready to embody the transcendent. It took thousands of years to wake, but will you wake for pity's sake? Beloveds, we're on the threshold of a quantum leap in consciousness no less dramatic than the emergence of life itself. And that is no small matter. We cannot expect it to be free of chaos and suffering. We know that evolution is not a gentle, continuous process, but punctuated by convulsive episodes of breakdown and renewal. But we can take courage, beloveds, from the wisdom of our new story that tells us that the evolutionary impulse towards greater goodness, truth, and beauty is a divine spark that lies within the heart of each of us, and its signature is love. So thank you for listening, and may we all find better ways of being human.